You're listening to the DCAU Review, hosted by Cal and Liam, streaming on iTunes, Google Podcasts, and at DCAUreview.com. Now, here's today's episode.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 73 of the DCAU Review. I'm your host, Cal. With me, as he always is, the other host, the man that runs our Twitter page, Liam, my good brother. Welcome to episode 73 of the DCAU Review.
Yeah, we got an interesting one to talk about today. We, as we mentioned last week, we did a Twitter poll to have you guys help us decide what the last episode of Static we'd be reviewing for the time being would be. And this one, with a pretty decent, sizable victory by the end there, is the episode Sons of the Fathers, Static Shock Season 1, Episode 7. A pretty heavy subject matter for a children's cartoon, to be sure. For sure.
And we've talked about that in Batman the Animated Series. That's one of the hallmarks of that original Batman animated series, is how they deal with things that are not necessarily children's cartoon material, and that's Saturday morning cartoon heavy. It's not, I don't remember too many super heavy racism storylines or you know, some of the other things that we've covered in Batman the Animated Series, homelessness or drug addiction. I don't remember too many of those storylines being involved in Spider-Man the Animated Series, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, those X-Men, those other those other superhero cartoons of that same era didn't necessarily deal with these heavy storylines, but this one does deal with a very sensitive storyline. So we will do our best to be as sensitive to that as we go through today, but we're excited certainly to cover this episode. Don't forget, if you would like to participate in future Twitter polls, you can always follow us at DCAU Review. We'd love to hear your voice, and not only talk to us about this episode in particular, but help us choose future episodes, Liam.
Absolutely. And before we get into our main plot discussion here, I, of course, have the now legendary Imdb Synopsis, which I must read.
Oh, I can't wait for this one.
And the synopsis for this episode, Sons of the Fathers, which was written by Christopher Simmons and directed by Dan Reba, reads as such. Virgil pressures a reluctant Richie to invite him to a sleepover, only to learn that Richie's father is a stubborn bigot. An embarrassed Richie runs away and is abducted by Static's archenemy, Ebon.
Well, that one gives far more details than I feel most synopses usually do.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll jump into plot, like we always do first and foremost. So our plot here deals with racism, obviously. We revealed, as the synopsis so eloquently put. The episode might as well been called Richie's Dad is a Racist.
Yes. We talked about that with one of our favorite episode titles for any DCAU show is Terry's Friend Dates a Robot.
Yep. And
how if maybe every DCAU episode should just have a literal title like that. And yeah, this one would be called Richie's Dad is a Huge Racist.
Right. Until the end, when he's suddenly not a racist anymore.
Yeah, and... ... Yeah, and that's kind of the frustrating part for me, because I think it's set up well. Richie and Virgil are just hanging out at Virgil's house, and Virgil's dad and sister are there, and and Virgil's sister's giving Richie a hard time about, why are you always over here?
I thought it's his mom. It's not his mom?
No, that's his sister.
He calls her Mrs. H, though, doesn't he?
No.
You sure?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
His mom's dead.
Richie's mom's dead, too?
No, Virgil's mom
I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about Richie's mom.
No, I'm talking about Virgil's. I'm talking about the beginning of the episode.
Anyway.
They're at Virgil's house. Virgil's sister is giving Richie a hard time about, why are you always over here? And then that kind of gets Virgil thinking, hey, Richie never invites me over to his house. And they kind of have a little bit of an argument. Finally, Richie agrees. And, when you get to the house, you can tell that, like, Richie and Richie's mom, not his sister,
his mom,
are all on edge, and especially once his dad comes home. And then, you figure out very quickly that his dad is a racist.
He starts by dropping subtle hints, like that he doesn't like that darn rap music.
Right.
Those hoodlums in the city that they live in, which is clearly a predominantly African-American demographic.
Talks about how he has to see them all day at work, and now he has to come home and find one in his house, I believe is.
Oof,
so they don't hold back on portraying this guy as a really, like, heinous...
They stop just short of using racial slurs.
Yes, there's no... this is still TVY, I think, so...
Yeah.
Or at least TVG, so no hard slurs or anything. But yeah, it's very clear this guy is a terrible bigot, and Richie, as a result, as said in the synopsis, runs away, ends up, of course, for the necessary fact of there needed to be villains for Static to fight, happens to run into the neighborhood where Ebon and Shiv are holed up, and
they overhear a conversation between Virgil, who is in his Static costume, speaking to Richie, and he finds out that, Ebon decides, well, if I capture this guy, then they can get Talon, who, in the very first fight scene of the episode, is sent to prison.
Right.
They'll do some sort of prisoner exchange, and maybe have the opportunity to wipe out Static at the same time. And the subplot, of course, is that both of the dads, both Richie and Virgil's dads, have to team up to try and find Richie and put up with it. It's like a buddy cop thing where one of the buddies is a huge racist. It's great. It's fantastic. It's like if Lethal Weapon, the one guy, and I've never seen Lethal Weapon, so I'm just going to assume, well, ironically, wait, is that Mel Gibson that's in Lethal Weapon? So, maybe not ironically, but I've never seen Lethal Weapon. Sorry, sheltered childhood, but I'm going to assume he's not a blatant racist. But imagine if Lethal Weapon, the characters from Lethal Weapon, if the one played by Mel Gibson was a blatant racist. That's pretty much what you have here, because they have to team up and try and find Richie together, and then of course they happen to stumble upon Ebon and Shiv and get into a battle with them that Static has to save them from. So, yeah. All right. So let's talk about the idea here of them tackling something that's. I don't recall that being... We had class warfare in Batman the Animated Series.
Yeah.
We talked about homelessness. We talked about orphans. We talked about drug addiction. I don't recall there being a straight-up racism storyline from Batman the Animated Series.
No.
Certainly none that we've covered this far in any of the prior 72 episodes that we've done here have we stumbled upon a racism storyline here in the DCAU. So for that, I give them kudos because, hey, it's a real-world thing, and I think we don't have, because we're both white, we don't deal with this on a regular... We don't deal with this. This isn't something that we face on a day-to-day basis. So in a vacuum of trying to communicate the struggles of racism to people that aren't necessarily experiencing that, I think they do an okay job of trying to explain that to a child.
Yeah, and I think it's good, and this is pretty early on in the run. Like I said, this is still in Season 1, and to kind of go so quickly into this sort of subject when you have, and we talked about that in our first episode, about the responsibility that the creators of this show and of the Static character of the Milestone Comics characters felt in showing the real struggles that specifically minorities went and still go through. And so getting this early on in this series that happens to be about a black teenage superhero to go to the racism episode so quickly, I give them a lot of credit for tackling that and for the network allowing them to do that pretty early on in the run. But then we get to the ending of the episode, which
we already briefly touched on.
Yes.
Explain to the fine listeners at home your issue with the very
end. So as you mentioned, everybody convenes at Ebon's hideout. Static, the dads, Richie. They have the fight. Static puts away the bad guys, and Richie and his dad kind of have a hug, and it's like, okay, that's fine.
Meanwhile, this whole time, Static's dad has been teaching Richie's dad that his son has broken this cycle of racism, and the reason why he's been avoiding him and the reason why he ran away is because of the bigotry.
Right. This moment where he was so racist to Richie's best friend was the straw that broke the camel's back, and not the whole reason for why Richie ran away.
And their interactions with other inner city youth that are homeless, that are majority African American.
Yes.
He has that opportunity to explain to them that they are good kids, that just because their skin is a different pigmentation doesn't mean that they're bad people.
Right, and that,
or because they're homeless, or
correct.
whatever.
He learned some lessons along the way. And I think if it just ended with Richie and his dad hugging, and his dad cries a little bit, and it's like, okay, that's fine. I think that's a decent ending. But then at the very end, they flash forward to some indiscriminate time in the future where where Virgil and Richie are going to Comic-Con, and his dad's taking him, and it's like, oh, now his dad is like so totally fine with Virgil being Richie's best friend, and he's excited to go to Comic-Con with his son and his son's best friend, and it's like, I don't like that they did like. So I'm of two minds about this. On one hand, I don't think it's a good story to just at the end have him be, I'm magically not racist anymore because Virgil's dad taught me some lessons, and then a black superhero saved my son's life, right. And now I'm not racist at all towards anyone anymore.
Correct.
I understand that if you're trying to teach a lesson, and this is still a show for children, that you want that to be the moral at the end, to show the man show what the problem was, what this person's faults were, and then he overcomes them and goes, I'm not going to be that way anymore. I appreciate that, but maybe they could have just done it in a more subtle way where it's like, I'm going to work on this, I'm going to really try. Not just have him be like, all right, everything's great now, and we put a nice little bow on it. I felt like that was... I just thought the way the ending went, it felt too abrupt for him to go from so racist as we saw him in the opening to just completely changing his ways in 10 minutes.
And it's weird because it's not even like they acknowledge it. I think we talked about briefly before we went on air. If you recall back to... one of my favorite episodes involving the Justice Guild on Justice League.
Yeah.
We have, which of course is called Legends, available in the archives at DCAUreview.com. Go back and check that out. One of our top-rated episodes of all time. Yeah. But if you check that out, there is a moment in that episode where the idea of racism is briefly touched on, and because they're transported to this 1950s era superheroes where Jon Stewart interacts with the all-white superhero team.
Right.
And the Streak says something to Jon Stewart after he saves somebody and says, oh, you're a credit to your people, son. Which is if you don't think about it or if you don't catch it, Jon makes sort of a surprised-looking face. But the reality is that was... I think in the 1950s, a way of people attempting to say that they weren't racist. Like, right. Oh, you're one of... You probably have heard the phrase, oh, you're one of the good ones. Or they're one of the good ones. If you ever talk to somebody that was born before,
yes,
1965, you may have heard that phrase about an African-American person. It is a extremely racist thing to say.
Correct.
But in their minds, because of maybe how they were brought up, or the era of the 40s, the 30s, 40s, 50s, where segregation was huge, and whatever, what have you, in their mind, it's a way of complimenting African Americans or somebody of a different race. So I would much, much, much rather there have been sort of a semi-awkward comment like that from Richie's dad, where in his mind he thinks he's grown to the point where he can accept Virgil at least, but not the entire... Maybe he's not embracing the full fact that... all of a sudden he's a changed man and he feels completely different about all African Americans.
Right.
I concur with you on that. And I feel like it's left ambiguous enough for you to assume that they just have made it to the point now where he's okay with all African Americans.
Yeah. And again, I just think a little more subtlety or a little bit more dialogue of them being like, look, he's a work in progress, but this is the furthest he's ever come as far as this topic goes. So
sure.
You could be like, he is changing, it's just going to take him a while, and it's a work in progress. And then later on, you could have done an episode down the line where you follow up on this topic.
Sure.
So that brought my score down a little bit.
Agreed.
I do think overall it's a good episode. Like I said, I think the way the subject matter is handled for most of the episode is really, really well done. Mm-hmm. So I gave Plot a 7 out of 10.
7 out of 10, okay.
Like I said, I think it would have been even higher if the ending was handled better, but because of that, it brought it down, I think, a couple points for me. But overall, I do still think it was a good plot, and I applaud them for tackling this subject, as I said, so early on in the series.
Okay, I was a tick lower. I went 6 out of 10. I think that you're right, that sort of putting the bow on everything's okay now because Richie's dad is no longer racist because of this one incident was a bit of a stretch and didn't make too much sense. So it sort of reminds me of the episode of The Forgotten where Bruce leaves at the end and nothing's really solved for any of the homeless people. It's just like, oh, you're Bruce Wayne, you're rich, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff.
Gives like 2 of them jobs.
Right. So what about the rest of it? So it's not really a solution or a satisfying ending in my opinion, or one that makes much sense at all. All right, let's move on to animation and visuals, Liam. So we talked about last week. Last week's episode was in the second season and certainly was an upgrade in the animation and visuals. This week's episode, we're back in season 1, and it was noticeably different. We're watching it, and the first thing, I figured it out, why I said in the very first episode, if you go back to Shock to the System, which was 2 weeks ago, also available on DCAUreview.com, or wherever you stream your podcasts. But if you go back and listen to that, I told you it looks like a Flash internet cartoon, like some of those like Gotham Girls, or some of those very, very early internet cartoons that you would just find maybe a short or something like that on the internet that was used with Flash animation. And the reason why I noticed today is there is zero shadow work at all. It is like you took a picture and put it in MS Paint and you just put you got the paint can and you filled with color, and that's what everybody looks like. There's no shadow work, there's no detail, there's no line work. And because of that, and comparing it to the other DCAU shows, again, we cut it some slack because this wasn't necessarily originally part of the DCAU.
Right.
There's a streamlined, more inclusive redo of the animation coming in Season 3, which we'll cover sometime in the future. But the animation still sticks out as just being so rookie. Like, it's so junior cartoon. It's even subpar to, like, a Marvel cartoon, like Spider-Man from the 90s cartoon, just because it's so, and I'm sure that had something to do with budget or a lack of budget. With that being said, I do like some of the character designs in this episode. Iban, I think, is a cool looking villain,
definitely. And
the funny thing about him is he has highlights and shadow work done on him. He's the only character in this episode that has highlights and shadow work done, but he's a very cool looking character. It kind of reminds me if you had Inque and who did I say?
Shadow Thief.
Inque and Shadow Thief. Yeah, Inque and Shadow Thief had a baby. Very. I'm still not quite sure, and maybe when we review the episode with his debut on it, we'll kind of understand better. I'm not quite sure where his powers sort of begin and end. He's sort of like gooey and works in the shadows, but also sometimes he can phase through buildings.
Yeah.
He can teleport at times, it seems, but he's absolutely affected by electricity, but sometimes he's not. With that said, very visually cool looking villain. I think some of the fight scenes between Static and the villains, that first scene where they're fighting in the mall was a pretty interesting, 1-on-3. Shiv and Talon are in there too, fighting. Static shocks Talon, and that you see kind of her feathers burst up as if like an actual bird had been struck by lightning.
Yeah, that was cool.
That was a good visual. So this is much stronger than that first episode from season 1 that we covered. Still not great overall. But I think you can see that they're moving towards a stronger animation style. So I went 6 out of 10. What about you?
Yeah, I had the exact same score. For most of the reasons you mentioned, I really like the visualizations of Iban's powers. Shiv's a cool looking villain. We talked about that a little bit last week. Another guy whose powers seem a little inconsistent.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it seems like he can just transform his hands into weapons, but then he also makes a metal bar to tie up.
Yeah, he creates a construct very similar to a Green Lantern.
Yeah, the dad's. So it seems a little inconsistent there, but he has. I like the visuals of his character. For basically everything else you mentioned, I would give it a 6 out of 10.
All right, let's move on to music, Liam. We mentioned in the very first episode that we covered that music seemed to be an afterthought for this. I think they took it up a notch for Season 2, as we covered in last week's episode. This week, we're back in Season 1, as we mentioned. I feel that music may or may not have taken a back seat again. There are a few scenes, I think the fight scenes are punctuated by the static theme, but for the most part, there's a real lack of music.
Yeah, we talked about this back when we reviewed The Batman, but it seems like this show a lot, at least in these early episodes, uses music at the intros of scenes, and then as you mentioned in the fight scenes. But in between, there's just a lot of, it's just dialogue and sound effects, where I think you could have used a little bit more music. There's a scene right after Virgil leaves Richie's house, where it's him just kind of staring out the window, and there's like a little musical interlude there that's nice. But then the rest of the scene, there's no music while he's sort of talking over this situation with his dad. So yeah, it's just kind of weird. It's to have that much dead air isn't the right word because there's dialogue and sound effects, but we just have so
no
much
ambiance.
Yeah, maybe that's the word for it. No atmosphere, but if you will. But so I give music 4 out of 10 because again, I think having more music there, especially during some of those really emotional beats, during when Virgil's father kind of has enough and really lets it all out against Richie's dad and talking about I've been dealing with your kind my entire life and you're your type of people and your son ran away from you a long time ago and all that stuff. Really could have used, I think, like a stronger theme there, and it's just the voice acting, which isn't bad, but we'll get to that in a minute here. But yeah, I think it could have used a little bit extra oomph in the music department, so I went 4 out of 10.
I concur with you. I went with the exact same score, which is why I had that exclamation. Yeah, 4 out of 10 for those very same reasons. The static theme is played in the final scene, and I thought that was great. That really amped up the excitement for that final battle scene between Static and Eban and Shiv. But other than that, there are some pivotal scenes, I think, that you're right, that missed out on the atmosphere. All right, Liam, let's move to our final category for this week, which is going to be voice acting. And we have a couple of regular returns, then we have a couple of new people for us. Let's talk about our players from this week.
Yeah, so obviously we have our main leads. We have Phil LaMarr as Static. We have Jason Marsden as Richie. And Kevin Michael Richardson as Virgil's dad. And then beyond that, we have some guest stars. Obviously, some returning villains. We've mentioned Tia Texada as Talon, and we had Brian Tochi as Shiv. We have our first episode reviewing, as we said, the character of Eban, Gary Anthony Sturgis, who's a voice actor, has done a ton of other voice roles, including on Batman Beyond and other shows in the DCAU. He's really, as you pointed out, just doing an Ice-T impression.
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
Which is funny, just because we just came off of the Batman Beyond episode a little bit ago, where Ice-T was actually the voice. But
Splicers, which is available at DCAUreview.com or wherever you stream your episodes.
There you go. And then the main guest voices, I guess, in this episode, we had Jean Smart as Richie's mom, she was on 24, she was on Psych, you would know her if you saw her, I think. Mm-hmm. And then Dan Laria, who was probably most famously on The Wonder Years as Mr. Foley. This is kind of a weird episode, I think, to score for voice acting. I think Kevin Michael Richardson as Virgil's dad is really, really good. I think, obviously, as we often sing his praises, Phil LaMarr as Static is good. And I think this was probably Jason Marsden's best episode as Richie that we've reviewed so far. But I don't think Dan Laria does a good job. It's I think, a very one-note performance. And part of that is he's just playing the hard-ass, mean, racist dad, so maybe he didn't need to have a lot of nuance in his performance. But I didn't think he was great, and I didn't think anyone else's performance besides Kevin Michael Richardson's really stood out to me as, great. So I just went with a middle-of-the-road 5 out of 10 score.
Okay. I actually didn't hate Richie's dad's performance, so I'll disagree with you a little bit on that.
Okay.
I thought that he played it pretty consistently, and I think that he did what he was asked to do. Like you said, he is the hard-ass racist, and he came across as, I could picture this guy being a racist based on his vocal performance.
Yeah.
With that said, and I have a hard time with a couple of things. One is the writing of dialogue in this episode. I said right from the get-go, it's from the very first scene. It sounds like it's written by white people who think that that's how African-American people talk.
Static says funky fresh at one point, which, I mean, even in the year 2000, that slang term was about 20 years out of date at least, maybe 30.
It's like cringeworthy at times, the dialogue that is supposed to be... it's just hard, and I get it. It's a children's cartoon. So
right.
They're gonna do what they want. But that, to me, sometimes borderline comes off as racist, because it's not like, oh, well, this is how black people talk. Well, I don't think that that's necessarily accurate, like you said. Even to the year 2000, I don't think that was super accurate. But
right.
With that said, I feel like it hampers the acting ability sometimes of the players, because Phil Lamar has to say these goofy phrases and bad. It's just very, very, very bad. It's bad writing, which I think hampers the performances at times. Lamar and Marsden have zero chemistry. Zero chemistry for me. Like, for two people that are supposed to be best friends, the deliveries that they have together, and again, this may be because of the lack of good voice direction, or just, I don't know, maybe they didn't record in the same room like the other DCAU shows did, but it just comes off sometimes as just being the opposite of what best friends are. I don't believe that they're best friends, and that's hard. That's hard to say, because you have Phil Lamar, who is a great voice actor, obviously. We've covered a lot of his work from Justice League and the other voices that he's done. And I don't think like, when I think of Static Shock, I think of his voice, but the issue is just sometimes he's hampered by the dialogue, and that brings down the performance. So I ended up giving voice acting for this week because of some of the awful lines. And I thought Kevin Michael Richardson did the heavy load carrying at times here. I think he was fine. I think Eban's Ice-T impression was solid.
Yeah.
Shiv can go jump in a lake because he's just the worst. He sounds like Cobra Commander or over-the-top Saturday morning cartoon character, which he's supposed to be, but mixed him with Eban together don't work very well. I gave voice acting 4 out of 10. It's just, it distracted me. Some of the performances distracted me from it, and it just wasn't great. So, let's tally up our scores here at the end, Liam. Pulling everything together, I have a final score of 19 out of 40. What about you?
Yeah, and I have a final score of 22 out of 40. So
you've consistently liked each of these episodes more than I have liked them.
Yeah.
But I think we agreed last week's episode was an episode that you'll want to watch again just because of its fun factor. Where do you fall on rewatchability recommendation for this episode? Is this a must-watch?
I would say if you want to watch, if you're specifically sitting down to watch the best episodes or the most important episodes of Static, yes, you should watch this. If you're just watching, like, best of DCAU as a whole, I think it's a skip.
I agree. Yeah, I think if you want to sit down and watch, okay, I want to see the highlights of Static, I think the plot and I give them kudos for the boldness, like we said, of being able to tackle a series, or going after to tackle a serious issue, and maybe they don't hit a bullseye on this one, but maybe they're second ring, as far as being on target. So if you're looking to watch a Static episode and you don't want to just watch a random one, yeah, sure, I recommend you to watch that. But overall, scope of DCAU doesn't really play a whole big part in anything, and doesn't really, to me, give much depth. In the end, it doesn't really give much depth to either character.
Yeah.
All right, Liam, well, that will wrap us up for this week's episode. Thank you again, everyone, for listening at home. As we've already mentioned a couple times, don't forget you can like and subscribe to us on multiple different podcast platforms now. We are on all the 3 major podcast forms, of course, that being Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and, of course, now Spotify. So make sure you like and listen and subscribe. You get those episodes delivered to you the second that they drop. You can also always find out about our upcoming episodes by following Liam at DCAU Review. Does a great job of running our Twitter page. Liam, you want to give the good folks at home a little preview of what's coming for next week?
Yes. So for the month of October, we've the spookiest character of all. We're going to review Superman episodes. I don't know. We're we
what would be really spooky? Superman's pal.
Oh my. Well, we'll see.
Ooh.
We'll see. I think we did promise we would review that sometime in the future, so we'll have to get to that one day. But regardless, we'll be reviewing Superman all October long. Gonna look for some more episodes, because I think the last few times we reviewed Superman, we found some of the really good, we found some of the not so good.
And the worst episode to date.
Correct.
We've reviewed, also available in the archives.
How about that? But, so we will see. Will we find more of the good, more of the bad, maybe something in the middle? Let's find out.
I can bet that we're not gonna. I would be willing to bet large amounts of money we will not find a worse episode than either.
Oh, let's hope so. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
But all right. That's what you can look forward to in October. You can look on Twitter. I'll be previewing the specific episodes that we'll be reviewing in the next couple of days here. And follow us on Twitter at DCAU Review. Check out the website, all the podcast places, Spotify, iTunes. I'm sorry, Apple Podcasts. We don't call it iTunes anymore for some reason.
Okay.
And Google Podcasts as well.
All right. Well, until next week's episode, I'm Cal.
And I'm Liam.
And we will catch you on that next episode of the DCAU Review.
Bye-bye.